Well, welcome again, and thanks for joining us. Let's bring you up to speed this hour. We're learning of reports of Ukrainian forces continuing to resist the Russian occupation of the city of Mariupol. Advisor to the city's mayor, Petro Andrushenko, says the city did not accept the occupation, claiming the 2 tow trucks and 3 other large vehicles were set on fire last week in the car park of the Russian Emergencies Ministry. He sent this out on Telegram today. And that post detailed the fatal stabbing of a ministry employee in a crowd while awaiting humanitarian aid near the city's metro. The southern port city was all but destroyed by weeks of shelling and is now at risk of a major cholera outbreak. We're also learning that thousands of civilians, including women, elderly people, and children, are trapped in Severodonetsk with a diminishing supply of clean water, sanitation, and electricity. A pledge by Russia to establish the humanitarian corridor to evacuate civilians holed up in a chemical plant in the city does not appear to have taken effect. Thousands are still trapped in bunkers beneath the Azot chemical plant in the city with a diminishing supply of clean water. The mayor of Severodonetsk says the Ukrainians are still in control, however, of the industrial districts and denies it's been completely cut off, although most of it is still in Russian hands. So the Russia-Ukraine conflict has brought many risks to the global agricultural and food system. Not our words, but that of the chief economist of the Rome-based United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, Mr. Maximo Torero. The FAO Council held its 170th session on Tuesday to discuss the impact of the Ukraine crisis on global food security, as well as on the organization's network. Torero said at the meeting that both Russia and Ukraine play a pivotal role in the world food export markets, and the current conflict between the 2 countries has brought many risks and uncertainties to the global agricultural and food system. He's calling on the world to take coordinated actions and provide economic assistance to countries most affected by the challenges. To allay the impact of the Ukraine crisis, the session of the FAO's executive body, the 170th, proposed to support affected countries with humanitarian aid and the funds for reconstruction, and also to help them to establish a food import financing mechanism and enhance social securities on food and nutrition. China's permanent representation at the FAO said during the meeting that China highly appreciates the FAO's work in dealing with the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and encourages the FAO to closely monitor global food security, to strengthen partnerships and policy synergy to support vulnerable countries and advance international agricultural cooperation to ensure the smooth flow of farm products. Today, however, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu has detailed a UN plan to create sea corridor from Ukraine for grain exports, saying safe routes could be formed without needing to clear the mines around Ukrainian ports. His comments appear to mark a shift from an earlier proposal to demine Ukraine's ports, a move that Kyiv fears would leave it far more vulnerable to Russian attack from the Black Sea. Mr. Cavusoglu discussed the plan with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Ankara last week, but said further discussions with Moscow and Kyiv were needed. Mr. Lavrov then said the onus was on Ukraine to clear mines around its ports for commercial ships to approach. Speaking to reporters earlier today, Cavusoglu said it would take some time to demine Ukraine's ports, and a safe sea corridor could meanwhile be established in areas without mines under the UN proposal, and that Ankara is still waiting Moscow's reaction to the plan. Russia says the West has isolated itself, but it is impossible to isolate Russia. Addressing a press conference earlier today, the country's foreign ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova said it was the West that turned down this partnership and cooperation of mutual interest. It has been routinely destroying the very fabric of our relationship. It applies to the economy, finance, energy. Security goes without saying, as well as because all fundamental principles on which strategic stability and security were based have been undermined. Everything was destroyed single-handedly by the West. Her words. She also added further at the press conference today, look what happened to countries that have risen up against the illegitimate, disrespectful, or destructive actions by the West. They were quickly blocked on all fronts. It's just impossible to isolate us, referring to Russia here. But what is possible is for the West to isolate itself. This is exactly what happened. If they isolated anybody, they isolated themselves from us. It is the absolute truth. US President Joe Biden says that temporary silos will be built along the border with Ukraine, including Poland, in a bid to help export more grain and address a growing global food crisis. President Biden told a Philadelphia Union Convention he was working on with other European countries to unlock the grain and bring it to the market to bring down food prices. Since the Russian invasion and blockade of Ukrainian Black Sea ports, grain shipments have stalled. More than 20 million tons are stuck in silos. Ukraine says it faces a shortage of silos for a new crop. And that war is stoking prices for grains, cooking oils, fuel, and fertilizer. Russia and Ukraine account for nearly a third of the global wheat supply. Ukraine is also a major exporter of corn and sunflower oil, and Russia a key fertilizer exporter.
What Putin's war has done is not only try to wipe out the culture of the Ukrainians, decimate people and commit innumerable war crimes, but he's also prevented the grain, thousands of tons of grain that are locked up in those silos ready to be exported, but they can't get out through the Black Sea because they get blown out of the water. So we're working on a plan to get it out through other countries by rail. But guess what? Ukraine has a system like Russia has, a rail gauge that is different than the gauge of the rest of the tracks in Europe. So we're going to build silos, temporary silos, in the borders of Ukraine, including in Poland, so we can transfer it from those cars into those silos into cars in Europe and get it out to the ocean and get it across the world. But it's taking time. We can do anything. Thank you.
In the meantime, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has met with the Ukrainian Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov in Brussels as NATO defense ministers are set to meet for talks in the Belgian capital. The Secretary General of the Military Alliance, Jens Stoltenberg, told a news conference today that a NATO summit in Madrid later this month is expected to agree on assistance package for Ukraine that will help the country with a move from old Soviet-era weaponry to NATO standard gear. He also said that members of the alliance will continue to supply Ukraine with heavy weapons and long-range systems, and he expects them to agree a new package of assistance to Kyiv at the summit.
Ukraine's soldiers and citizens are doing just that. And they are defending their homeland with resolve, grit, and ingenuity. So we've got a lot done thus far, but we don't have any time to waste. So we're here to dig in our spurs. We're going to deepen our support for the Ukrainian armed forces in today's fight, and we're going to build their enduring strength for tomorrow's dangers. And by working together, we can help Ukraine defend itself from Russia's cruel assault. And we can strengthen Ukraine's security for the long haul. And we can rally together to show that rules, in fact, do matter. And that might does not make right.
About that meeting with the NATO defense ministers later today, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said members of the alliance will continue to supply Ukraine with heavy weapons and long-range systems, and he expects them to agree a new package of assistance to Kyiv at the summit. He says that allies are committed to continuing to provide Ukraine with military equipment to prevail, including heavy weapons, long-range systems, as well as other assistance. The former Norwegian Prime Minister says the summit, which will take place in Madrid later this month, is expected to agree, of course, that assistance package that Mr. Lloyd talked about earlier, which will help the country move from old Soviet-era weaponry to NATO standard gear.
Are committed to continue providing the military equipment that Ukraine needs to prevail. including heavy weapons and long-range systems. I expect that at the summit, NATO allies will agree a comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine, helping Ukraine for the longer term to transition from Soviet-era equipment to modern NATO equipment, and to improve interoperability with NATO.
I have joining me now geopolitical analyst Major Adebayo Adeleke. He joins me from Texas in the United States. Major, thank you for making it on the program. Ukraine has been asking for these advanced weapons to fight the war against Russia, and we're hearing, the NATO Secretary General talking about, providing Ukraine with those advanced weapons. But Russian forces are still advancing east of Ukraine. It's becoming clearer Russia's on a mission to annex the country. What will Ukraine's European partners do when this happens?
Hey, Marachi, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be back here. As we kind of see how this whole situation in Ukraine has unfolded over the last few weeks, and it's taking shape, actually, from Russian perspective, what their intent is from the get-go. So what we've seen over the last few weeks is the shaping of the battlefield, and what this battlefield is going to be looking like maybe now or the later. But it's coming to, there's one thing that is resoundingly clear across the board, which is the fact that it's a war of attrition. As you can see, as Russia is kind of re-enlisting and mobilizing soldiers to all the servicemen, as we call it, servicemen and women, to join the fight. And so this is where this whole thing is going to play out. It's going to determine, whoever is going to come on top of this particular conflict is going to be who has the willpower to go the long haul. As you can see, Russia is dogging, and I think we below us, as we see as well, Ukraine is really dogging as well. And Ukraine will to continue in this fight depends on the weapons and the weaponry and the training of those personnel to actually utilize those weaponry against the Russian forces. It's quite critical to them moving forward. As you can see over the past few weeks, Russia has they're trying to have operational advantage in Donbass. So as you can see, it's a war of attrition, economic, logistics, material, and political will. And that of Ukraine is that will is kind of tied up with the West. So as long as the West has the appetite to stand tall against Russia, the Ukraine will be there. So this idea of sending in weapons will continue as long as the West has the appetite for it. And unfortunately, it is what it is. Ukraine has now become a proxy war front for both the West and Russia. And that is what is kind of shaping up right now. So it's a willpower war. Whoever has the will is going to come out. Has the most will is going to come up on the long run. So Russia has the issues of mobilization, and I believe is wearing down on Ukraine as well. How many people wants to continue to fight this fight? So whoever is willing to fight this fight is going to come in on top. But political will, economic will, and all that wills out there. So it's a wall of will at this point.
I hear what you're saying, and somehow I agree. Yes, whoever has the political will, whoever has the will, of course, will come out on top. But Ukraine has been receiving these weapons, from the West. Russia's been reporting it has been destroying some of them at the depots where they're being stored. But it would appear that Ukraine receiving weapons from the West, well, not even just today, but since the invasion started, will probably have the upper hand in this war. Unfortunately, the upper hand seems to be going to Russia.
Yes, so in supplying warfare is completely different, because supplying weapon is one thing. The ammunition that needs to be fired in those weapons is another thing entirely. So getting weapon is one deal, but the constant supply, logistical supply of those weapons, and that's what Russia has been able to do to kind of interdict those supply chains networks. So as you can see, the global war is battling inflationary issues right now due to supply chain. So is Russia and Ukraine war also has been the issue of supply chain. So getting those weapons from the West to Ukraine is not a problem. but the ammunitions, the constant supply of those ammunitions without being interdicted is a major issue. And that is what, not only on the communication side, but on the logistical side, that is how Russia is trying, using guerrilla war tactics to interdict those things and be able to disrupt it. So the Ukraine has to have that pipeline flowing in and out for them to be able to sustain these things. And they're also doing the same thing as well on the Russian side. So like I said, it's a battle of the will. So the West will continue to supply, but the ammunition that is being fired in those weapons has to have that free flow. If not, it's going to be very quick for Ukraine. But as we're seeing right now, there's a dogged war. Everybody is trying, and from what we are seeing, from what St. Petersburg is displaying, how some of those annexes is going to be incorporated into Russia. All geopolitical landscape is going to shape up in the in the nearest future. It's becoming quite interesting. So this is their war. This is their game plan from the get-go. So annexation is what it is, and we've talked about this a bit. So it's quite interesting, unfortunately, as well.
Now, there is a global food crisis on the horizon, and I know the leaders are meeting in Italy. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN is drawing attention to, the global food crisis, and so is the rest of the world. But governments are talking about mitigation, and that's fine. But before we get to the real crisis, when it begins to really bite harder, what do you think could point Ukraine and Russia to the path of peaceful resolution of this war? Because right now, the peace talks are down. There is no negotiation on the table.
Absolutely. And either way, you have to also understand that what started this whole thing, a lot of negotiation started, hours and hours of negotiation before it resulted into this. When the West was saying that this thing is going to turn into a war, everybody thought that they were just blocking smoke off their you-know-what. But now it has become a full-blown war, and everyone globally is actually suffering from it, especially if your staple is based on grains. Now, there is no concession in any time soon. It's going to happen because somebody has to come up on top. Russia has to save face, and Ukraine, because of what they have global support, also have to come up some kind of way. So there has to be a middle ground in which both of them can either draw a truce or come out without somebody being defeated in any shape or form. And this global war, this food crisis, and I saw what President Biden said about building silos. I don't know who's advising him on this, but this is going to be quite difficult because you have to be secure first actually to produce grains. And even asking Ukrainians to go back to farms and start getting grains is going to be quite, I believe, is quite disingenuous. So as long as there is no peace in any time soon, I don't think any mitigation strategy can come out of Ukraine, Russia war, especially when it comes to the issue of, from their output to the rest of the world with grains and whatnot.
Yeah, and even the Ukrainian government says they cannot, store into silos because they have no space. But what they have, of course, will be enough for them. At the end of the day, Ukraine has neither been inducted into NATO, neither the European Union. And this was the reason, why the excuse, not the reason, but the excuse the Russian government gave with its invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine is still fighting this war. Should they reconsider memberships now? I know they already said they will be postponing, pushing back the membership of NATO, but really, have they experienced friendship enough from the West and from these European countries to still want to join them at the end of the day?
This is the case of damn if you do, damn if you don't. And at this point in time, Russia has already shown their card. So at this point, the most ideal thing to do is actually get them involved. But I don't know the process at this point in time. There's also Russia sympathizers in some of these. We have Turkey that might actually, do a wild card over there. So some of those things have to be politically managed. But at this point in time, if the West continue this particular purpose and they see that the turning the tide in Ukraine-Russian war is impossible without them being boots on ground. I think the most ideal thing is to get them accepted into the NATO and actually let NATO forces actually assist the Ukrainian forces in turning the tide on this. For me, from my perspective, I think that's thing that can actually bring this thing to a screeching halt. I don't think Russian forces, I believe during the midst of this whole thing that the West, as we see it, has overestimated the Russian forces. But at the same time, they will not be, the Russian forces right now, without any support from the West, will not be able to hold them down. So the best case scenario for this thing to come out is either Ukraine kind of figure out a way to kind of surrender or find a truce, or the West actually, kind of adopt them into the NATO and then let the NATO forces actually join forces with the Ukrainian forces to combat. And I think that will settle a lot of things down. But the way the posturing is from the West at this point in time, I think they until things change, until they see something that is drastic, that's going to put the Ukrainian kind of sovereignty in peril, I think that's when they're going to intervene, look at some. But as it stands right now, I think they believe that the method they are using, kind of the subtle proxy kind of war fighting in the Ukraine is the way to go. And unfortunately, people are still dying. I just realized that it's 1,300 personnel was found in a mass grave, especially. So Ukrainians are not going to trust Russia at any point in time, anytime soon, as they're trying to do desanitization. So, which is going to be very problematic as well, because I don't know how they can govern these things from where they are from St. Petersburg. So.
Wow, a really grave situation on the ground in Ukraine. Major Adeleke, thank you so much for speaking with us.
As always, thank you, Amarachi.
Coming up after the break. Of course, a look into the renaming of the monkeypox virus by the World Health Organization, and it says it's also looking into the virus being sexually transmitted.